In the fading light of a cold autumn evening in Salem, Ohio, 1862, the Pritchard household stood stoic and silent among the scattered farms and sparse houses. The world around it whispered with the ordinary sounds of creaking wood, distant church bells, and the rustling of dry leaves. But inside the weathered clapboard walls a different silence reigned, a heavy, unnatural silence that felt almost alive. The Pritchard family consisted of 3 boys, ages 8, 6, and 4, whose faces were pale and eyes too wide, too watchful for children so young. They moved through the house like ghosts tethered to a cold ritual. No laughter escaped their lips, no cries, no whispered secrets. These boys had never spoken a word, not because they could not, but because they were not allowed to. Their silence was no accident but a carefully cultivated void, a cruel design imposed by unseen hands that ruled the household with grim precision. Their mother had long since vanished, swallowed by sorrow or madness, leaving the boys under the care of their Aunt Mercy and Uncle Eli, figures both respected and feared in the community. These caretakers, outwardly mild and devout, enforced a strict regimen that went beyond mere discipline. Each day was a repetition of strict routines and silent exercises where sound was treated like poison, and speaking was a sin punished without mercy. The boys were drilled to erase their own voices, not just in speech but deep within their minds, as though silencing their souls. The ritual was methodical, meals taken in absolute quiet, eyes never meeting, and gestures precise and minimal. Even their breaths seemed measured and restrained, as if the very act of breathing loudly might summon an unspeakable punishment. What the town did not know, and what the boys could never express, was that this silence was part of a larger, darker design, a ritual to strip away identity, to render them empty vessels, shadows shaped by fear and pain. The house held secrets that lurked behind locked doors and shuttered windows, secrets that hummed in the stillness like a low, relentless pulse. Neighbors whispered of strange lights flickering late at night and the faint, eerie sounds that sometimes slipped out, sounds neither human nor animal. But no one dared to intervene. The Pritchards were known to be a proud family, and their silence commanded a strange respect, mingled with dread. Inside, the boys lived under a cold gaze that measured their worth by their submission to this unnatural quiet. Any tremor of sound was met with harsh correction, a swift slap, a tightening grip on fragile limbs, or worse, the unspoken threat of being locked away in the so-called whispering chamber, a place spoken of only in fearful whispers. The boys' minds, fragile as they were, began to twist and fracture under this pressure. Without voice, their thoughts curled inward, echoing in dark chambers of fear and confusion. Their innocence was a fragile veneer masking a slow, creeping erosion of self. This silence, far from peaceful, was a cage built stone by stone from ritual, cruelty, and a grim logic that saw voices as dangers to be eradicated. Beneath the calm and orderly surface, the Pritchard boys' silent world was a slow, burning prison of psychological torment, setting the stage for horrors that even the quiet town of Salem could not imagine. The stillness was only the beginning, a prelude to a darkness that waited patiently to be revealed. Though the Pritchard boys remained outwardly silent, their quiet was far from peaceful. In the deep hours of the night, when the wind shifted and shadows thickened, strange sounds began to slip from the house, not words, never words, but something else entirely. These were eerie whispers that seemed to crawl beneath the skin, low murmurs rising and falling like a secret language only the boys themselves could hear. They were not the innocent babbling of children, but strange, unnatural noises, a weaving of breath and tension that felt less like communication and more like a summons from the darkness within. Their voices were fractured echoes, sometimes a wet, rasping sound, Other times, a sudden sharp cry, swallowed quickly as if shame or fear had frozen their tongues. It was as if the boys carried an ancient, haunting song locked inside, one that refused to be silenced despite every attempt to crush it. The townsfolk, first dismissive, began to feel unease as these disquieting sounds floated through the cold Ohio air, slipping through cracks in the Pritchard house like a ghostly presence no one could grasp. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men averted their eyes and neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. The sound was intangible, yet tangible enough to seed dread. No one wanted to confront the family directly, for the Pritchards had a reputation of being both devout and fiercely private, and an invisible barrier seemed to keep outsiders at bay. Yet the boys' whispers grew louder in their own way, a fractured chorus of fear, pain, and something more, something that felt neither fully human nor wholly sane. Within their small, pale faces, eyes darted nervously, reflecting the weight of unspoken torment. They communicated not with words, but with the subtle curl of their fingers, the twitch of a cheek, or a breath held too long. These gestures were coded signals, understood only by those trapped within the silence, a grim lexicon born from years of cruel conditioning. Behind closed doors, the boys would gather in a tense, ritualistic manner, their small bodies huddled close, creating a fragile shield from the relentless watch of their caretakers. The silence forced upon them was not simply absence, but a presence itself, a force that bound and suffocated, forcing their spirits into dark corners where madness waited patiently. This language of shadows was a secret rebellion, a desperate attempt to claim some part of themselves that the household tried so methodically to erase. The Pritchard home, once just a house, became a stage for this quiet struggle, a place where the boys' unheard voices echoed louder than any cry. Their tortured murmurs seemed to seep into the walls, twisting through the rafters like a creeping fog that no one could stop or understand. Some neighbors swore they heard chanting when the wind blew just right, low voices rising in a cadence that felt both ancient and sinister. Others claimed to see flickering candlelight behind shuttered windows, a sign of rituals that extended beyond the visible world. Fear wrapped itself tightly around the town, binding people in silence as thick as the Pritchards. The boys' unnatural sounds unsettled the boundary between innocence and menace, between the living and something else, stirring a primal dread that whispered through Salem's quiet streets. Despite their growing unease, the community's fear became a wall, blocking any hope of intervention. No one could claim what those whispers meant. Were they cries for help, prayers, curses, or something worse? The boys' strange language, born from trauma and twisted ritual, became a haunting enigma, a sound neither fully present nor absent, echoing in the hearts of those who dared listen. The weight of these unheard voices pressed down on the town, pulling it closer to an unknown darkness waiting patiently to unravel. Aunt Mercy and Uncle Eli were the invisible hands shaping the silence that clung to the Pritchard boys like a shroud. Mercy, with her thin, pale face and eyes that never quite smiled, carried the cold weight of unwavering conviction. Her hands, delicate but firm, administered rituals that blurred the lines between devotion and cruelty. Every morning began with a prayer said in a whisper, not for the boys to hear, but as a command to remind them that their voices belonged to a higher purpose, one they must not claim for themselves. Mercy believed the boys' silence was a divine mandate, a purification of the impurity that lurked within their souls. She saw herself not as a tormentor, but as a guardian of salvation, her cruelty justified by a warped sense of righteousness. Uncle Eli, in stark contrast, was a man of science and obsession, his workshop a labyrinth of strange instruments and notebooks filled with meticulous observations. His mind was sharp and methodical, a clinical surgeon dissecting sound itself. To him, the boys were experiments, vessels to unlock secrets of voice and spirit. His procedures were precise and unrelenting, blending the arcane with the scientific. He invented devices designed to suppress the boys' ability to speak while amplifying their inner suffering. Eli's methods were cold and calculated, the kind of cruelty that left no visible scars but seared the mind with invisible flames. Together, Mercy and Eli maintained a relentless regimen. Mercy's rituals involved cleansing the boys with bitter herbs and chanting prayers meant to purify the voice. She would anoint them with tinctures that burned the skin subtly, a constant reminder that their silence was sacred and necessary. The boys' hands were bound in silence bracelets woven from iron and leather, symbols of their captivity. Eli's interventions were darker still. He crafted delicate cages that fit over the boys' throats, mechanisms that strangled the muscles involved in speech but allowed breath and life to continue. These devices were hidden beneath scarves and collars, invisible to the untrained eye but agonizingly present to their victims. Eli kept detailed records of the boys' reactions, measuring their pain and mental deterioration as if he were studying a scientific specimen rather than children. The house was suffused with an oppressive atmosphere, where Mercy's whispered prayers and Eli's cold calculations mingled into a single force bent on erasing voice and identity. Neither caretaker showed affection, but both exhibited a cruel devotion to their purpose. Mercy's face often tightened in what might have been sorrow or fanaticism, while Eli's eyes gleamed with cold satisfaction when his experiments produced results. Results measured not in happiness or health, but in silence enforced and control absolute. The boys lived within this grim symbiosis, caught between Mercy's ritualistic fanaticism and Eli's clinical obsession. Their minds bent under the dual pressure, their fragile identities ground down by a systematic erasure of their voices. This was no ordinary abuse, but a ritualistic crucible designed to burn away selfhood, leaving behind empty shells that fulfilled Mercy and Eli's terrifying vision. The town whispered about the caretakers in fearful tones, their reputations wrapped in shadow. Mercy was said to be a woman touched by a divine mission, unyielding and harsh in her ways. Eli was rumored to dabble in forbidden knowledge, obsessed with the mysteries of sound and spirit to an unhealthy degree. Together they were the stewards of a darkness hidden behind the facade of normalcy and piety. This unholy guardianship ensured the Pritchard Boys' silence remained unbroken, a silence born of ritual, science, and a cruel love twisted beyond recognition. As the night fell and the house settled into its eerie stillness, Mercy's whispered prayers and Eli's clicking instruments continued their work, driving deeper into the boys' minds and bodies, carving silence into flesh and soul alike. Their vigilance was absolute, their cruelty masked beneath a veneer of care, but their methods revealed a mind consumed by a macabre purpose. To purify voices by erasing them, to create obedience through silence, and to hide an unspeakable evil behind the mask of innocence. The guardians of silence had no intention of letting their precious ritual falter. Behind a heavy oak door, bolted tight and sealed against any sound, lay the whispering chamber, a room that existed beyond the bounds of ordinary cruelty. To the untrained eye, it was a modest space, small and unadorned, but inside it held a darkness designed to break what little remained of the boys' humanity. The walls were thick, lined with dense layers of materials meant to swallow any noise, trapping echoes and muffled breaths like ghosts caught in a cage. This was no simple punishment chamber. It was an instrument of psychological alchemy, a place where silence became a weapon and torment took shape not in bruises but in fractured minds. The boys were placed there alone, often for hours or days at a time, stripped of any connection to the world outside. Time lost meaning in the chamber's dead air, each minute stretching endlessly into a void where senses betrayed the mind. Mercy and Eli believed that by isolating the boys in this soundless prison, they could strip away the last vestiges of will, purifying them through unbearable emptiness. Yet the torment was not only the absence of sound, but also the presence of an oppressive stillness that pressed against the skin like thick fog. Inside, the boys' senses warred against one another, sight dulled by the dim, unnatural light. Touch heightened to the point that every breath, every heartbeat seemed deafening in its intensity. The chamber contained strange apparatuses designed by Eli's cold ingenuity that manipulated sensory input. Devices would emit faint vibrations under the floor, disorienting the boys' balance and sense of space. A low hum, almost imperceptible, was broadcast through hidden speakers calibrated to unsettle the mind, to dissolve thoughts into panic. Sometimes, they were plunged into near-complete darkness, their eyes straining against the black void, or into blinding light that forced their pupils to close and minds to reel. The walls themselves seemed to pulse, not with life but with menace, creating an illusion that the room breathed with a malevolent will. Inside the whispering chamber, the boys' thoughts became prisoners as well. The silence forced them to confront themselves, to hear the twisted echoes of their own fractured minds. The ritual was to break them slowly, to replace their identities with something hollow, obedience forged through the shattering of will. Mercy's prayers echoed faintly from beyond the door, a sinister hymn that transformed isolation into a sacred rite. This was not punishment for a crime, but a ceremony meant to erase the boys' voices forever. Yet the boys resisted in their own silent way, their minds twisting the chamber's sensory tortures into hallucinations, visions of shadowy figures, and whispered threats that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. They began to see shapes moving in the dark corners and to hear whispers not from outside but from within themselves, as if the chamber had awakened a dormant evil lodged deep in their souls. The psychological scars carved here were invisible but no less real. Their minds frayed under the pressure, slipping toward madness or something worse, a cold, empty acceptance that silenced more than speech. This torture was methodical, ritualistic, and precise. Eli's instruments tracked every reaction, every sign of mental fracture, his clinical notes growing more obsessive as he sought the perfect formula for obedience. Mercy's chants framed this horror as divine cleansing, convincing herself that this was mercy, not cruelty. The boys emerged from the chamber changed, hollowed and haunted, their eyes reflecting the chamber's darkness, their bodies trembling from the sensory onslaught. Their silence was deeper now, a void carved by the whispering chamber's relentless grip, a silence that was no longer peaceful but filled with screaming shadows. This room was a crucible of horror, a place where innocence was ground to dust and the boys were remade into something less than human. And outside, the world remained unaware, the door shut tight, hiding the ritualistic evil that lived behind the quiet walls of the Pritchard house. Beneath the pale skin of the Pritchard boys lay a secret invisible to the naked eye. Scars etched not by knife or flame, but by a secret ink infused with a darkness that only revealed itself under the cold light of the moon. This was no ordinary mark, but a cruel ritual painstakingly performed by Aunt Mercy and Uncle Eli, a ceremony that branded the boys as vessels for a legacy older and darker than the quiet town of Salem could imagine. In the stillness of night, when the world around them slipped into shadow, the boys' bodies would shimmer faintly, revealing intricate symbols woven across their flesh like spider webs, twisting sigils and cryptic patterns that pulsed with a faint, otherworldly glow. These marks were more than decoration. They were a binding contract, a silent oath imposed without choice, sealing the boys' fates to a family curse that demanded silence and submission. Mercy's trembling hands mixed the ink from rare herbs and ground minerals, combining superstition with something far more sinister. a substance said to capture and imprison the very essence of voice and soul. Eli, with his scientific obsession, refined the formula, ensuring the marks penetrated deep beneath the skin, embedding themselves in flesh and memory alike. The boys endured the ritual with no knowledge or understanding, their fragile bodies held still as Mercy traced the symbols carefully, whispering prayers that sounded more like curses, chants meant to awaken the power hidden within the ink. The pain was quiet but sharp, a burning sensation that lingered long after the ritual ended, as if the marks were slowly fusing with their very being. To the caretakers, these marks were a purification, a means to control the boys' voices beyond the physical. The symbols acted as seals, muffling their cries, imprisoning their inner selves beneath layers of invisible torment. But the marks carried a deeper horror, a supernatural aura that seemed to tether the boys to something ancient and malevolent, a dark force that whispered promises of power in exchange for obedience. As the moon passed through the night sky, the marks would glow faintly, casting an eerie light that no one outside the house could see. The boys themselves sometimes shivered under the moon's gaze, as if sensing the presence of something watching through the inked symbols, something waiting patiently in the shadows of their souls. This hidden cruelty was a twisted form of identity theft, a branding that erased childhood innocence and replaced it with a haunting legacy of silence and submission. The boys bore the weight of these marks invisibly, carrying a secret pain that no one could touch, a private torment that tethered them to Mercy and Eli's unholy design. The town knew nothing of these marks, the ritual sealed behind locked doors and whispered prayers, invisible to neighbors and authorities alike. But for the boys, the unseen scars were a constant reminder of the family's dark purpose, an eternal chain forged in ink and blood that tied their voices to a silence deeper than any physical restraint. And beneath the moon's cold glow, the marks pulsed softly, a living symbol of the evil that hid behind the Pritchard house's quiet walls, a legacy whispered only in shadows, and carried forever on skin that seemed at first glance so fragile and innocent. In the shadowed confines of the Pritchard house's hidden workshop, Uncle Eli's true horrors took shape. Devices born not of rage but of calculated cruelty, where science and ritual merged into something far colder and more precise than simple punishment. Among these inventions, the most insidious was known only as the vocal cage, a delicate contraption crafted to cage the very voice it sought to control. Surgically implanted into the boys' throats in a grim procedure carried out under the guise of cleansing, the vocal cage was a twisted marvel of cold innovation. Its thin metal framework and intricate wiring compressed the muscles of speech, muffling any attempt to form words while simultaneously amplifying the internal screams. Those silent, unbearable cries lodged deep inside the mind and body where no one could hear them but the boy himself. This device transformed voice from a tool of communication into a prison, a cage that held the boys' words hostage and twisted their suffering into a private hell. The surgical scars were carefully hidden beneath their skin. The wounds closed with a cold precision that left no outward sign of the torment hidden beneath. Eli's obsession with controlling the voice was clinical, his notes filled with detailed observations of how the vocal cage altered the boys' breathing, heart rate, and mental state. He recorded how the device forced their bodies into constant tension, trapping them in a liminal space between silence and unbearable internal noise. This was cruelty not born of passion but of calculation, a scientific discipline wielded as a weapon against innocence. The boys learned quickly that any attempt to speak to break the silence triggered the device's cruel mechanism, tightening painfully, constricting muscles, turning the act of screaming inside out into a torturous echo chamber of soundless agony. Their internal screams reverberated endlessly, a private torment as real and as cruel as any physical blow, but invisible to the world. Mercy's role was not diminished by Eli's cold science. Her rituals framed these procedures as sacred rites, cloaking them in prayers and chants meant to sanctify the silence enforced by the vocal cage. She spoke of purification through muteness, of voices sacrificed to protect the family's secret legacy. Together, their methods created a system of torment that was as psychological as it was physical. The boys' minds became prisons as much as their bodies, trapped in a loop of silence enforced by cold, clinical design and spiritual fanaticism. This methodical silence was no mere absence of sound, but a presence that crushed the soul. The boys moved through their days with strained breaths and trembling bodies, the weight of their internal screams bending them toward madness. They became shadows of children, eyes haunted by the knowledge that their voices were imprisoned, their pain invisible and their pleas unheard. In the quiet halls of the Pritchard house, the vocal cage was a testament to the terrifying blend of science and superstition, a tool that transformed innocence into suffering with surgical precision. It was a device that spoke not through words but through silence, a silence that screamed. And as the boys lived under the relentless grip of this cruel innovation, the true horror lay not just in the device itself but in the minds that crafted and justified it. Minds that wore the masks of care and normalcy while orchestrating a methodical destruction of voice and self. This was evil perfected, hidden beneath a veil of science, ritual, and the unbreakable silence it imposed. Within the suffocating silence imposed by Aunt Mercy's rituals and Uncle Eli's cruel devices, the boys' internal voices did not fade as intended. Instead, they grew louder, twisting into a discordant chorus that clawed at the edges of their fractured minds. These were not simply thoughts, but fragmented echoes of memories, some their own, scattered and broken like shards of shattered glass, others alien and dark, whispered into their souls by a force older and more sinister than any earthly torment. The silence forced upon them was meant to contain these voices, to cage them beneath layers of ritual and machinery. Yet it became a crucible where madness brewed. Inside their heads, the boys battled an invisible tempest, where fleeting moments of clarity were swallowed by surging waves of fear, confusion, and something worse. A creeping presence that seeped into their thoughts like poison. This presence was not easily named or understood, but its fingerprints stained their waking hours and haunted their dreams. It whispered promises and threats in equal measure, a spectral shadow that claimed a stake in their very being. As their minds fractured under the relentless pressure, the boys' sense of self began to erode. Memories blurred, identities dissolved, and the lines between reality and nightmare bled together. They glimpsed visions of shadowed figures lurking just beyond perception, symbols glowing faintly beneath their skin, and echoes of voices not their own. Voices that spoke in tongues long forgotten, carrying secrets of bloodlines cursed and rituals eternal. This spectral chorus grew into a maddening cacophony, each fragment a thread in a tapestry of inherited darkness woven through generations of the Pritchard family. The boys' eyes, once wide with fear, now flickered with the cold light of those touched by something beyond human understanding. Their silent bodies betrayed no sign of the torment raging within, yet inside, their minds were battlefields where innocence was crushed beneath the weight of ancestral sin, and the inescapable grasp of a curse that refused to be silenced. Mercy and Eli's attempts to enforce silence only fed the darkness as the boys' voices turned inward, growing sharper and more urgent, demanding release even as their bodies remained bound by invisible chains. The ritualistic cruelty had failed to extinguish these internal cries. Instead, it had summoned something darker, a force that thrived in silence and fed on fractured souls. This force was neither fully supernatural nor entirely of this world. It was a metaphysical evil born of twisted legacy and cold obsession, an echo of ancient rites designed to control and consume. The boys were caught between two worlds. The one they once knew, and the shadow realm whispered into their minds by the dark marks and rituals they bore. Their sanity teetered on the edge. Fragmented memories flashing like broken lanterns in a storm, illuminating glimpses of horrific truths too terrible to face fully. The internal voices became their constant companions, a chorus of madness and fragmented pasts that promised no peace, only the relentless unraveling of mind and soul. In the heart of the Pritchard house, this hidden war raged silently, unseen by the world, a grim testament to the failure of cruelty cloaked in normalcy. The boys' minds were no longer their own. They were battlegrounds for a darkness older than the town itself, a curse that whispered through blood and bone, defying every attempt to silence it. This was the true horror beneath the silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something waiting patiently inside, ready to claim the last fragments of innocence left in those haunted eyes. Aunt Mercy's hands, so steady and cold as they administered the cruel rituals, bore the weight of a lifetime of silence, a silence that had once claimed her own voice and shattered her world. Before she became the stern guardian of the Pritchard Boys' muteness, Mercy had been a young woman filled with dreams and laughter, a voice bright and clear in the small town of Salem. But fate was cruel. A sudden illness, whispered among townsfolk as a curse or divine punishment, had stolen her voice completely. No cry, no whisper, no song remained. Mercy was condemned to a silent existence. This loss fractured her spirit, driving her into despair and isolation. The vibrant woman faded into a ghostly figure, haunted by the absence of her own words and the growing fear that without a voice, she was nothing. It was this terror, raw and consuming, that twisted Mercy's mind and set her on a dark path. The silence she had been forced to endure became an obsession, not just her own, but one she sought to impose on others. In her warped logic, if the voice was the source of pain and danger, then controlling or extinguishing it was an act of mercy. The very same silence that destroyed her became her weapon and her salvation. Mercy's cruel methods were born from desperate fear, a bargain she struck with herself and the dark forces she barely understood. She convinced herself that by stripping the boys of their voices, she was protecting them from the chaos that had shattered her own life, saving them from the torment of unspoken horrors. But beneath this twisted hope lay something darker, a desire to wield power where once she had been powerless. Her rituals, her prayers, and her iron grip were the manifestations of a woman broken and remade into a guardian of silence, one who believed that submission was safety and suffering was salvation. This cycle of abuse, born from Mercy's own pain, perpetuated the legacy of silence that bound the Pritchard family. The boys were not just victims of external cruelty, but prisoners of a sorrow and madness passed down like a poison in blood. Mercy's face, often a mask of cold resolve, sometimes flickered with a shadow of the woman she once was, a woman lost in grief, clinging to the fragile hope that her actions could somehow protect what little remained of their family. Yet her tenderness was twisted, suffocated beneath layers of fanaticism and control. The mercy she offered was harsh and absolute, a bargain made in darkness with no promise of redemption. Her cruelty was not random, but a calculated attempt to conquer the silence that once conquered her, to shape the boys in her own broken image. In this desperate bargain, Mercy became both victim and villain, a woman who lost herself to the silence she could never escape, determined to bind others to the same fate in the hope of finding peace through control. The chilling truth of her story deepened the horror of the Pritchard house, revealing how pain and fear could birth monstrosity beneath the mask of normalcy. Mercy's bargain was a haunting reminder that cruelty often wears the guise of protection, and evil can grow from the seeds of a broken heart. Uncle Eli's journals were a window into a mind both brilliant and disturbingly detached, a ledger of cold calculations and obsessive experiments that mapped the fragile boundaries between sound, mind, and something darker still, the elusive essence of voice. As a vessel of spirit, in his cramped study surrounded by pages filled with neat, precise handwriting and detailed diagrams, Eli laid bare his relentless pursuit of knowledge, a pursuit that transcended science and wandered into forbidden realms of metaphysics and ritual. His notes chronicled trials on the boys, devices designed to modulate vocal cords, instruments that recorded the faintest vibrations of breath, and observations on how silencing the voice seemed to twist the spirit itself. To Eli, the voice was more than sound. It was a key, a secret gateway to power and control that humanity had long misunderstood. He believed that within the act of speaking lay a hidden force, a spiritual energy that could be harnessed, contained, and weaponized. This conviction drove his cruel innovations, from the vocal cage to the whispering chamber, each designed to probe deeper into the relationship between silence and soul. Eli's journals revealed experiments that blurred the line between medicine and madness. He documented attempts to isolate the spiritual echo left behind when speech was forcibly muted, theorizing that suppressing the voice trapped fragments of the self, fragments that could be measured, manipulated, and even harvested. His cold calculations stripped away any hint of compassion. The boys were data points in a grand design, specimens in an unholy laboratory where science was wielded without conscience. The entries grew darker as Eli pursued his obsession, exploring ancient texts and forbidden rites, weaving superstition into his scientific framework. He speculated on rituals that could bind voice to spirit, notes on symbols inscribed on flesh, and incantations whispered over the boys to tether their inner voices to his devices. This blend of clinical observation and arcane ritual revealed a man who believed himself to be a pioneer at the edge of knowledge, a master over forces few dared to confront. Yet beneath the veneer of genius lay a ruthlessness that saw the boys not as human beings but as vessels to unlock the secrets of existence. His obsession with sound was a mask for a deeper hunger, the desire to control life itself through the intangible, to silence rebellion by erasing the soul's expression. Eli's journals were a testament to methodical evil dressed as science, a cold pursuit that justified any cruelty in the name of discovery. The pages pulsed with a quiet horror, a record of how one mind could turn knowledge into a tool of domination, how ritual and science could intertwine to create new forms of torture disguised as progress. In the Pritchard house, Eli's cold calculations were the unseen engine driving the family's dark legacy, the blueprint for an evil that was precise, patient, and terrifyingly human. Beneath the suffocating weight of imposed silence, a subtle rebellion began to stir within the Pritchard boys. Fragile, whispered, and nearly lost in the oppressive quiet, yet unstoppable in its quiet gathering of strength. Their fractured voices, once isolated shards of despair and confusion, started to merge into a spectral chorus, a haunting, dissonant force born from years of ritualistic cruelty and cold, scientific torment. This internal uprising was neither loud nor obvious. It was a creeping, intangible pressure that twisted through their minds and bodies, a slow-burning unrest that began to fray the edges of Mercy and Eli's iron grip. The boys' fragmented memories and suppressed thoughts found strange new ways to coalesce, their internal screams weaving into a collective tapestry of defiance and madness. It was a rebellion not of speech but of presence, a force that lurked beneath the surface, growing stronger as the rituals designed to contain it started to crack. Inside the house, the subtle tremors of this upheaval were almost imperceptible. A glance too sharp, a breath held too long, a flicker in haunted eyes. But to those attuned, the signs were unmistakable. The carefully maintained silence began to unravel as Mercy's prayers faltered, her steady hand trembling for the first time, and Eli's cold instruments registered strange anomalies, readings that defied his meticulous calculations. The whispering chamber's suffocating grip loosened. The vocal cage's cruel precision was no longer absolute. The boys' silent revolt seeped into the fabric of the house, disrupting the ritualistic order and exposing the monstrous secrets long buried behind closed doors. Outside, the townsfolk, once fearful and silent themselves, began to sense the dark undercurrent pulsing beneath the Pritchard family's quiet facade. Whispers grew louder, rumors tangled with suspicion and dread, and the fragile veil of normalcy wore thin. What had been hidden in shadow and silence crept toward the light, a slow but relentless unveiling of horrors no one was prepared to face. As the boys' voices rose, not in sound but in force, the foundation of cruelty that Mercy and Eli had built began to fracture, revealing the macabre heart of their methodical evil. The ritualistic cruelty, the scientific obsession, the silent scars, all came into sharp, devastating focus, laying bare a legacy of torment and madness. This was a moment of reckoning where silence shattered and the true nature of the Pritchard house was exposed. The boys, once prisoners of silence, became agents of their own broken fate, their internal rebellion a terrifying echo of the darkness that had shaped them. In breaking the silence, they forced the world to confront a nightmare long concealed, a nightmare born of twisted love, fanaticism, and cold calculation. The psychological tension that had simmered beneath years of ritual erupted, shifting the story from hidden torment to a harrowing exposure. The quiet house, once a prison of whispers, now trembled on the brink of collapse, as the unspeakable horrors it harbored threatened to spill into the world beyond. When the heavy veil of silence that had long cloaked the Pritchard house finally lifted, the small town of Salem could no longer look away. For decades, a quiet complicity had allowed the family's dark legacy to fester in the shadows, whispered rumors dismissed as superstition, fearful glances exchanged but never spoken aloud. But as the truth spilled into the streets, the community was forced into a painful reckoning, confronting horrors it had silently endured or willfully ignored. The discovery of the boys' mutilated silence, the ritual scars glowing faintly beneath their skin, and the cruel devices implanted to cage their voices shattered the fragile calm that had masked years of torment. Neighbors who had lived next door to the Pritchards grappled with disbelief and guilt, haunted by the knowledge that the screams they never heard had echoed within their midst. The town's silence fractured under the weight of these revelations, replaced by shock, anger, and sorrow that rippled through every corner of Salem. Families who once exchanged polite greetings now whispered in fear and suspicion, eyes cast downward or darting toward the shadowed house where the boys had been imprisoned by methodical evil. Town meetings grew heated with debates over blame and responsibility, the community's moral fabric strained by the enormity of what had been concealed. Some demanded justice, others sought explanations, but all were bound by a shared grief for innocence lost and voices silenced. Yet the reckoning came at a terrible cost. The fragile peace that had held the town together was irrevocably broken, leaving scars as deep as those etched invisibly on the boys' flesh. Families fractured by fear, neighbors turned into strangers, and a pervasive unease settled like a dark cloud over Salem's streets. The weight of complicity pressed heavily on the town's conscience, a constant reminder that silence, once broken, reveals horrors too vast to ignore and too painful to bear. Memorials were quietly erected, not with grand ceremonies, but as solemn acknowledgments of the suffering endured in silence. Laws began to change, aimed at protecting the vulnerable and preventing such atrocities from hiding behind normalcy again. Yet beneath these outward signs of progress lingered an unspoken question. How many more secrets lay buried in quiet towns like Salem, waiting to shatter the fragile peace of everyday life? The town's reckoning was more than an unveiling of past crimes. It was a mirror held up to society's darkest tendency, to turn away, to silence uncomfortable truths until they explode into undeniable tragedy. Salem became a cautionary tale of how methodical evil, cloaked in innocence and masked by silence, can thrive unchecked when a community chooses fear over confrontation. The emotional and moral turmoil left the town forever changed, a haunting testament to the cost of silence and the price of finally speaking the unspeakable. The aftermath of the Pritchard saga left Salem forever altered, its streets haunted by echoes that refused to fade with time. The scars carved into the boys' silent bodies mirrored the invisible wounds etched into the community's conscience. Wounds that no law or memorial could fully heal. In the months that followed the revelations, the town grappled with a collective reckoning, passing new laws aimed at protecting the vulnerable, outlawing secrecy, and demanding transparency where silence once reigned. Memorials rose quietly in churchyards and town squares, simple stones inscribed with names and dates but heavy with meaning. Symbols of remembrance for lives overshadowed by cruelty and the enduring weight of unspoken horrors. Yet even as these measures sought to close the wounds, they could not erase the chilling truth that evil often thrives not in chaos or loud violence, but in the quiet spaces where normalcy masks darkness. The Pritchard House, once a monument to silent suffering, stood as a grim reminder that silence can be a shield for cruelty. A tool wielded by those who hide behind facades of innocence and care. This silence is not empty. It is a presence, a slow, creeping force that allows evil to seep into everyday life unnoticed, to grow beneath the surface while the world looks away. The confessions unsealed in the wake of the town's reckoning revealed a tapestry of fear, denial, and willful blindness. Neighbors who heard too little, authorities who investigated too late, and a community that clung to quiet to preserve its fragile peace. Evil, it seemed, was not just in the acts themselves, but in the silence that enabled them. The absence of voice that turned victims into shadows and horrors into whispers. The philosophical weight of this truth settled heavily on Salem's soul, a question haunting every street corner and whispered in every prayer. How can society guard against a darkness that wears the mask of normalcy, that thrives in the absence of sound, and that finds strength in the voices we refuse to hear? The Pritchard Boys' tragic story was a stark warning that evil need not shout to be terrifying, that silence can be as deadly as any blade, and that the most methodical monsters often dwell behind the most ordinary doors. In reflecting on this, Salem's legacy became one of vigilance, a reminder that to confront evil one must listen not only to what is spoken but also to the silences that linger between words. The echoes of the past, painful and persistent, demand a watchful presence, a refusal to let silence become a sanctuary for darkness ever again. What do you think? Could this happen again? The story of the Pritchard Boys ends not with loud cries or dramatic confrontation, but with a lingering silence heavier than any voice. A silence that speaks volumes about those who suffer unheard, whose pain remains hidden beneath layers of normalcy and fear. Their quiet torment, etched into flesh and spirit, demands more than remembrance. It calls for vigilance, empathy, and a willingness to confront the shadows that hide behind everyday life. These boys, voiceless in the world's eyes, became vessels for a darkness few dared to acknowledge, trapped in rituals designed to erase their humanity while cloaked in the guise of care and protection. Their story is a chilling reminder that evil often does not announce itself with thunder but creeps in softly, wearing the mask of innocence or duty, thriving in silence and secrecy. As the echoes of their suffering fade into history, they leave behind a haunting question. How many more silent victims remain hidden in places we never look, unheard by those who might save them? This is not just a tale of one family or one town, but a mirror held up to every community, every heart, every mind. It challenges us to listen more carefully, to see beyond appearances, and to give voice to those who cannot speak for themselves. In closing this chapter, the story turns to you, the witness, the listener. What do you think? Could such silence and cruelty take root again, unnoticed and unchallenged? The answer lies not in the past, but in our vigilance today. The quiet horrors, the unseen monsters, and the methodical evil that hides behind normalcy still exist, waiting, watching, and thriving wherever silence reigns. To remember the voiceless is to promise that their suffering was not in vain, that their stories will break the silence and ignite the courage to speak out. The legacy of the Pritchard Boys is a call to action, to never ignore the quiet, to question the calm, and to stand as voices for those who remain unheard.